What happens when a beloved television host faces off against someone who thinks the rules don't apply to them? In just 31 seconds, one shocking comment would turn a routine interview into television history and expose the true character of someone the world thought they knew. This is the story of how Meghan Markle went from royal duchess to public enemy number one, all because she couldn't handle being asked a simple question. The Daily Show studio buzzed with its usual energy. Jon Stewart sat behind his desk, adjusting his tie and reviewing his notes one last time. Tonight's guest was supposed to be a friendly chat, a softball interview to promote her latest charitable initiative. The producers had promised an easy conversation, the kind that makes everyone look good and sends viewers home happy. But something felt different from the moment Meghan walked onto the set. She swept in wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than most people make in a month. Her smile bright but somehow cold. The audience applauded politely as she took her seat, but even they seemed to sense the tension in the air. "Welcome to the Daily Show, Your Royal Highness," Jon said with his trademark grin, the same warm greeting he'd given to presidents and movie stars alike. Meghan's smile faltered for just a moment. "Actually, Jon, I prefer to be called Meghan now. The royal titles are so limiting, don't you think?" The audience chuckled nervously. Jon raised an eyebrow but kept his composure. "Of course, Meghan, at Island. So tell us about this new foundation you've started. What's the mission?" "Well," Meghan leaned back in her chair like she owned the place, "I realize that regular charities just don't understand what real impact looks like. They're stuck in these old ways of thinking, you know? So I decided to create something revolutionary, something that actually makes a difference." Jon's journalist instincts kicked in. Something about her tone rubbed him the wrong way. "That's interesting. Can you be more specific about what makes your approach so different from existing charities that have been helping people for decades?" Meghan's eyes flashed with irritation. "Jon, I think you're missing the point. When you have the platform that I have, when you've lived the life I've lived, you see things differently. Most people just don't have that perspective." The studio fell silent. Even the camera operator seemed to pause. Jon's smile tightened just slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Help me understand that perspective, Meghan. What exactly have you seen that the rest of us have missed?" "Look," Meghan said, her voice taking on a condescending tone that made several audience members shift in their seats. "I've been inside the system. I know how these institutions really work. Most people are they're just not equipped to understand the complexities of real change." Jon set down his cards and looked directly at her. The studio lights seemed to get brighter, more intense. "Are you saying that regular people, regular charities, they're just not smart enough to help others effectively?" "I wouldn't put it that way," Meghan replied, but her tone suggested she absolutely would put it that way. "I'm just saying that when you've operated at the level I have, when you've had access to the rooms I've been in, you develop a different understanding of how the world works." The audience was completely silent now. You could feel the energy in the room shift, like a storm building on the horizon. Jon leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm but with an edge that his regular viewers knew well. "Meghan, I've interviewed Nobel Peace Prize winners who've spent their entire lives helping people, and somehow they managed to explain their work without suggesting that everyone else is beneath them. What makes your foundation so special that regular people can't grasp it?" Meghan's mask slipped completely. Her voice rose, sharp and defensive. "You know what, Jon? This is exactly the problem. The media, people like you, you're so invested in tearing down anyone who dares to dream bigger, to think beyond your small-minded limitations." The camera caught Jon's face perfectly. His eyebrows shot up, and for a moment, he looked genuinely surprised. The Jon Stewart who had faced down politicians and corporate executives with his wit and wisdom suddenly found himself dealing with something entirely different. "Small-minded?" Jon repeated slowly, like he was tasting the words. "Meghan, I'm just asking you to explain your charity work. How is that small-minded?" "Because you're trying to put me in a box," Meghan snapped, her voice echoing through the studio. "You want me to be just another celebrity doing just another charity, but that's not who I am. I'm trying to revolutionize philanthropy, and all you can do is ask these basic, surface-level questions." Several audience members gasped audibly. This wasn't going like any Daily Show interview anyone had ever seen. Jon's producer could be seen in the corner, making frantic hand gestures, but Jon waved him off. He was a professional, and he was going to handle this professionally. "Okay," Jon said, his voice careful and measured. "Let's talk about revolution then. What specific revolutionary changes is your foundation making?" Meghan threw her hands up in frustration. "See, this is what I mean. You're still thinking in these conventional terms. Revolutionary change isn't about specifics, Jon. It's about vision. It's about having the courage to imagine a better world instead of getting bogged down in these mundane details. Mundane details, Jon repeated, and now there was definitely an edge in his voice. Like helping actual people with actual problems? That's not what I said, Meghan shot back, but her voice was getting higher, more strained. You're twisting my words because you can't handle the fact that someone is thinking bigger than your little comedy show perspective. The audience collectively inhaled. Had she really just insulted The Daily Show? Had she just called Jon Stewart small-minded? The man who had spent decades holding powerful people accountable? Who had fought for 9/11 first responders? Who had become America's most trusted voice during the darkest political times? Jon sat back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had just been handed a gift. My little comedy show perspective, he said quietly. Interesting. Tell me, Meghan, what exactly qualifies you to revolutionize philanthropy? What's your background in charitable work? Meghan's face flushed red. I don't need to justify my qualifications to you, Jon. I've lived a life of service. I've used my platform to amplify important voices and shine a light on crucial issues. Which issues specifically? Jon pressed, his journalistic training taking over completely now. And what measurable impact have you had? Measurable impact? Meghan laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Jon, you're so obsessed with these metrics and numbers. Real change doesn't always fit into neat little spreadsheets. Sometimes you have to trust that the right people are doing the right work. The right people? Jon said slowly. And you've decided that you're one of the right people? I know I am, Meghan replied without hesitation, and the certainty in her voice was stunning. I have the platform. I have the connections. I have the vision. Most importantly, I have the courage to actually do something instead of just sitting behind a desk making jokes about people who are trying to make a difference. The studio was dead silent. Even the technical crew had stopped what they were doing. Jon Stewart, the man who had made his career out of never being speechless, sat there for a long moment, just staring at his guest. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the studio. Meghan, do you realize what you just said? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Meghan blinked, seemingly confused by Jon's sudden shift in tone. The studio lights felt hotter now, and you could practically hear the collective breath-holding of everyone in the room. What do you mean? Meghan asked. But there was uncertainty creeping into her voice for the first time all evening. Jon leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. When he spoke, his voice was measured and deliberate, the voice of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of holding powerful people accountable. You just told me that I sit behind a desk making jokes, while you're out there actually making a difference. You called my show little. You called my questions small-minded. You suggested that regular people and regular charities are just not equipped to understand real change. He paused, letting each word sink in. Do you stand by those statements? Meghan shifted in her chair, her confidence wavering. I think you're taking my words out of context. Am I? Jon's eyebrows shot up. Because I think our audience is smart enough to understand exactly what you said. Aren't you, folks? The audience erupted, not in applause, but in a mixture of boos and shocked gasps. Someone shouted, "She's crazy!" from the back. Another voice called out, "Kick her off!" The energy in the room had completely transformed from polite television audience to something much more raw and real. Meghan's eyes went wide. She clearly hadn't expected this reaction. Now wait just a minute, she said, raising her voice to be heard over the crowd noise. I'm being attacked here. You're being attacked? Jon's voice cut through the noise like a knife, and the audience immediately quieted down to hear his response. Meghan, I asked you about your charity work. That's literally my job. How is that an attack? You're trying to make me look bad. Meghan shot back, and now she was standing up from her chair, pointing an accusatory finger at Jon. This was supposed to be a friendly interview, and you've turned it into some kind of interrogation. Jon remained seated, calm, professional. The contrast was striking. I asked you what makes your foundation different from other charities. That's the most basic question any journalist would ask. If that feels like an interrogation to you, maybe the problem isn't with my questions. The problem, Meghan said, her voice getting louder and more shrill, is that you can't handle interviewing someone who operates on a different level than your usual guests. You're used to talking to comedians and politicians who play your little games, but I'm trying to have a real conversation about real issues. The audience was getting restless again. Someone shouted, "Sit down." Another voice called out, "Answer his questions." The energy was building towards something explosive, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Jon held up a hand, and amazingly, the audience quieted. This was his house, and everyone knew it. Meghan, he said, his voice still calm but with steel underneath, I've interviewed everyone from presidents to human rights activists to Nobel Prize winners. I've had real conversations about real issues with people who've dedicated their entire lives to helping others. And somehow, they all managed to explain their work without insulting me, my show, my audience, or the millions of people who work for charities around the world. That's different, Meghan insisted, but she was clearly losing ground fast. Those people are working within the system. I'm trying to change the system. By insulting everyone who came before you, Jon asked? By suggesting that decades of charitable work by millions of dedicated people is somehow inferior to your vision? I never said that. You absolutely did say that, Jon replied without missing a beat. You said regular charities don't understand real impact. You said most people aren't equipped to understand real change. You said I have small-minded limitations and a little comedy show perspective. Those are your words, Meghan, not mine. Meghan looked around the studio wildly, as if searching for support that wasn't coming. The audience was clearly against her now, and even the crew members she could see were shaking their heads or looking away in embarrassment. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice cracking with frustration. I came here to talk about important work, and you've turned it into a circus. I've turned it into a circus? Jon's voice rose for the first time all evening. Meghan, you're the one who called my life's work a joke. You're the one who suggested that everyone else is beneath you. You're the one who's standing up and pointing fingers instead of having a conversation. How exactly did I create this circus? That was the moment, the exact second when Meghan Markle completely lost control. Because you're jealous, she screamed, her voice echoing off the studio walls. You're jealous that someone with real influence, someone with real connections, someone who actually matters in the world is sitting here instead of some nobody you can push around? The studio went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock or surprise. This was the silence that comes when something so outrageous has been said that everyone needs a moment to process it. Jon Stewart, the man who had faced down presidents and prime ministers, who had taken on corrupt corporations and dishonest politicians, just stared at her. His mouth was slightly open, and for a moment, he looked like he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. Someone who actually matters, he repeated slowly. As opposed to my audience, I assume? As opposed to the millions of people who watch this show? As opposed to the charitable organizations you've been dismissing all evening? Meghan realized she had gone too far, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. That's not what I meant, and you know it. But yes, Jon, some people have more influence than others. Some people have access to resources and networks that can create real change. That's just reality. And you're one of those special people? Jon asked. Yes, Meghan said without hesitation. Yes, I am. The audience exploded. This time there was no controlling them. People were on their feet, shouting, booing, demanding that she be removed from the stage. The sound was deafening, a wall of pure outrage that seemed to physically push against Meghan. Jon stood up slowly, and somehow, even over all the noise, his movement commanded attention. The crowd began to quiet, waiting to see what he would do next. Meghan, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the studio, I think it's time for you to leave. The words hit Meghan like a physical blow. Her face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession. Shock, disbelief, rage, and then something that looked almost like panic. She had clearly never been asked to leave anything in her entire life. Excuse me? She said, her voice climbing to a pitch that made several people in the front row wince. You're kicking me off your show? I'm asking you to leave, yes, Jon replied calmly. He was still standing behind his desk, but his posture was relaxed, professional. This wasn't emotional for him anymore. This was just a host doing his job. You've made it clear that you think my show is beneath you, that my audience doesn't matter, and that asking basic questions about charity work is somehow an attack. I think we're done here. This is unbelievable, Meghan shrieked, and the sound echoed off the studio walls. You invite me on your show, you attack me with your questions, and now you're throwing me out because I dared to defend myself? The audience was on their feet now, and the sound was incredible. They were cheering Jon, booing Meghan, and shouting things that couldn't be broadcast on television. The energy was electric, dangerous, like a crowd at a boxing match when someone goes down hard. Jon raised his hand again, and once more, the crowd responded to him. They quieted down, but you could feel the tension crackling in the air. Meghan, Jon said, and his voice was perfectly calm. I didn't attack you. I asked you about your charity. That's literally what you came here to promote. The fact that you can't answer basic questions about your own foundation without insulting everyone in this room says everything we need to know. I answered your questions, Meghan shot back, but her voice was shaking now. I tried to explain the bigger picture, but you were too small-minded to understand it. There it was again, small-minded. The audience erupted once more, and this time Jon didn't try to quiet them. He just stood there, watching Meghan dig herself deeper and deeper. The bigger picture, Jon said when the noise died down slightly. Right, the bigger picture where regular people don't matter, where existing charities are worthless, and where you're the only one qualified to help anyone. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said, Jon replied, and now there was steel in his voice. And you know what, Meghan? Even if you hadn't insulted me, even if you hadn't insulted my audience, even if you hadn't dismissed the hard work of millions of charitable people around the world, you still haven't answered the most basic question. What does your foundation actually do? Meghan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For all her talk about vision and revolution and being qualified to change the world, she couldn't give a straight answer about her own charity work. It's complicated, she finally stammered. No, Jon said quietly. It's not. Feeding hungry people isn't complicated. Building houses for the homeless isn't complicated. Teaching kids to read isn't complicated. What's complicated is explaining why you think you're better than everyone else who's been doing this work for decades. The audience was hanging on every word now. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. This was a moment of truth, the kind that changes how people see the world. Meghan looked around desperately. The cameras were still rolling. The audience was still hostile. Her carefully constructed image was crumbling in real time, and she could feel it happening. You don't understand, she said, and her voice was smaller now, less confident. You don't know what it's like to have the kind of platform I have, the kind of responsibility. Responsibility? Jon's eyebrows shot up. Is that what you call insulting charity workers and calling my show little? Is that responsible behavior from someone with a platform? I never meant. Meghan started, but Jon cut her off. Yes, you did mean it, he said firmly. You meant every word. You think you're special. You think you're above everyone else. You think regular people and their problems are beneath your notice. And when someone asks you to explain yourself, you lash out like a child throwing a tantrum. Meghan's face was bright red now. Whether from anger or embarrassment, it was impossible to tell. I don't have to listen to this. No, Jon agreed. You don't. That's why I asked you to leave 5 minutes ago. But instead of gracefully exiting, you've decided to have a public meltdown on national television. That seemed to snap something inside Meghan. She spun around to face the audience directly, her eyes wild and desperate. You people don't understand, she shouted at them. I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to make the world better, and all you can do is sit there and judge me. The audience's response was immediate and brutal. The booing was so loud, it seemed to shake the building. People were standing, pointing, shouting, things that definitely couldn't be broadcast. Someone threw something, though it was impossible to see what in all the chaos. Jon moved quickly around his desk, not toward Meghan, but to position himself between her and the audience. Even in the middle of this disaster, his instincts were to protect his guest from the crowd she had turned against herself. Okay, he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. That's enough. Security. 2 large men in dark suits appeared as if from nowhere, moving quickly but calmly toward the stage. They weren't rough or aggressive, but their presence immediately changed the energy in the room. Meghan saw them coming and seemed to realize that this was really happening. She was really being removed from The Daily Show in front of a live audience and millions of viewers. This is a setup, she screamed, backing away from the security guards. This whole thing was designed to make me look bad. You planned this. Jon looked at her with something that might have been pity. Meghan, nobody planned this. Nobody could have planned this. You did this to yourself. The security guards reached her then, and one of them spoke quietly in her ear. Whatever he said seemed to get through to her, because she stopped struggling and let them guide her toward the exit. But she wasn't done yet. As they reached the edge of the stage, she turned back one last time. Her face, a mask of rage and humiliation. You'll regret this, Jon Stewart, she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. You have no idea who you're messing with. I have friends in places you can't even imagine. This isn't over. The threats hung in the air for a moment, and then the audience exploded again. But this time it wasn't just booing. People were laughing. Actually laughing at the absurdity of it all. Here was someone who had spent the entire evening claiming to be above everyone else, and she was ending it with threats and conspiracy theories. Jon just stood there and watched her go, his expression unreadable. When the studio doors finally closed behind her, he turned back to his audience and shook his head slowly. "Well," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the studio, "I guess that's what happens when you ask someone to explain their charity work." The audience erupted in applause and laughter, the tension finally breaking. But Jon wasn't smiling. He looked tired, almost sad. "You know what, folks?" he said as the applause died down. "I've been doing this job for a long time. I've interviewed a lot of people who think they're better than everyone else, but I've never seen anything quite like what just happened here." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "The truth is, there are thousands of people working in charities right now who are doing incredible work, with no recognition, no platform, and no royal connections. They're feeding people, housing people, educating people, and they're doing it because they believe every person matters. Not because they think they're special, but because they know everyone else island." The studio was completely quiet now, hanging on his every word. So if you want to help people, if you really want to make a difference, maybe start by remembering that the people you're trying to help are just as important as you are. Maybe even more important. He sat back down at his desk and looked at his notes, but everyone could tell he was shaken by what had just happened. "We'll be right back," he said quietly, and the camera cut to commercial. In television history, there have been moments that define careers, that change how people see celebrities, that reveal character in ways that can never be taken back. What happened that night on The Daily Show was one of those moments. It was the moment when someone who thought they were untouchable discovered that respect has to be earned, not demanded. And once you lose it, sometimes you never get it back.